Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want you to imagine something quiet, something vast, something that feels less like a lecture and more like a slow walk along the edge of memory. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. If the history of our species were a 300-page book, nearly 290 of those pages have been torn out, scattered into a fire, and carried away as ash on the wind. What remains in our hands are only the final chapters, the recent flickers of cities, farming, temples, and empires. The rest is a prehistoric time gap that science still cannot fully explain. A missing human history stretching back roughly 280 to 290,000 years between the emergence of anatomically modern humans and the dawn of agriculture. This is not a story meant to frighten you. It is not about conspiracy or panic. It is about reflection. It is about standing quietly at the edge of a canyon of time and listening to the echo. When we speak of Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, we are speaking of a species that looked like us nearly 300,000 years ago. They had the same shaped skulls, the same delicate hands, the same capacity for language and imagination. And yet, for most of that immense span, there were no cities, no written myths carved into stone, no vast agricultural fields shimmering under the sun. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity lived in a rhythm so subtle that it left only faint footprints. Stanley H. Ambrose, writing in 1998 about late Pleistocene population bottlenecks and volcanic winters, suggested that our species may have passed through severe climatic crises, perhaps even shrinking to relatively small populations. Imagine entire generations living through ash-darkened skies after massive eruptions, the air thin and cold, survival uncertain. Imagine small bands of humans huddled together, their stories spoken only around firelight, their knowledge carried in memory rather than monument. The prehistoric time gap is not empty, but it is quiet. It is a canyon carved not by water, but by absence. We know anatomically modern humans existed. We know they migrated, adapted, survived. Yet the missing human history between their emergence and the agricultural revolution feels like those torn pages, fragile, half-burned at the edges. Why did it take so long for farming to appear? Why did cities bloom only in the last thin slice of our timeline? These are not accusations towards science, they're acknowledgments of humility. Even in the age of satellites and genetic sequencing, there are spaces in our story that remain dimly lit. When we say history for sleep, we are not dismissing it as dull. We are inviting you into a slower tempo, into the long breath of 290 pages turned to smoke. Imagine standing at the lip of a vast canyon at dusk. The wind moves softly. Below you lies the depth of time, layered in ash and sediment. Each layer a generation, each generation a heartbeat. The canyon does not shout its secrets, it whispers. It reminds us that most of what it means to be human happened before cities, before writing, before we began measuring our worth in monuments. The prehistoric time gap is a meditation on patience, on endurance, on the quiet resilience of small communities scattered across continents. Genetic research in the past decades, including work by David Reich and colleagues on ancient hominin lineages, has revealed that our story is even more complex than we once believed. We interbred with other human groups. We shared landscapes with Denisovans and Neanderthals. The missing human history is not a void, but a tapestry with threads we are only beginning to see. And yet so much remains uncertain. What did their songs sound like? What dreams did they whisper into the dark? Tonight, as you rest, Let this thought comfort rather than unsettle you. We are the descendants of people who survived the unrecorded chapters. The ashes did not erase them. The torn pages did not silence them. They lived, loved, adapted, and passed something forward. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now close your eyes again and picture those missing pages drifting like warm embers into the night sky. The story is not lost. It is simply waiting in the canyon of time, written in ashes, patient and vast. The brain that is helping you listen to these words right now is, in almost every structural sense, nearly identical to the brain of anatomically modern humans who walked this planet 300,000 years ago. The same folds of cortex, the same delicate neural architecture capable of memory, imagination, fear, love, curiosity. And yet, those early humans did not build cities of stone. They did not write books. They did not construct observatories or launch even the most primitive machines toward the stars. So tonight, as we continue our quiet journey into the prehistoric time gap and the missing human history, let us sit gently with this human evolution mystery. If they had our brains, why did civilization take so long? When paleoanthropologists speak of anatomically modern humans, they are referring to people whose skeletons, whose cranial capacity, whose physical structure would not look out of place in a crowded subway station today. Fossils from sites in Africa dated to nearly 300,000 years ago reveal faces, jaws, and skulls that are unmistakably ours. The modern brain was already present in a Stone Age world. Stanley Ambrose, writing about late Pleistocene population bottlenecks, reminds us that our species did not move forward in a smooth, uninterrupted line. Climate fluctuated violently. Massive volcanic eruptions may have cast ash into the atmosphere, triggering volcanic winters. Small bands of humans likely survived in scattered refuges, their numbers perhaps reduced, their communities fragile. In such a world, survival was the primary architecture. There was little room for monumental ambition. And yet, pause for a moment and imagine yourself among them. You possess language. You possess abstract thought. You can plan. You can remember stories from your childhood. If you were alive for 280,000 years before the first cities appeared, what would you do? Would you carve symbols into bone? Would you gather others and experiment with planting seeds? Or would the daily demands of hunger, cold, and migration quietly shape your choices into something simpler? The paradox is not that they lacked intelligence, it is that intelligence alone does not create civilization. Civilization requires stability, surplus, cooperation on scales that take time to build. For most of the prehistoric time gap, humans were highly mobile hunter-gatherers. Mobility is a form of wisdom in unstable climates. When the ice advances, you move. When drought comes, you adapt. The modern brain evolved not in skyscrapers, but in landscapes of shifting grasslands and forests. Genetic research, including work by David Reich and colleagues in 2010 on archaic hominin groups like the Denisovans, shows that our ancestors were not isolated geniuses waiting for a breakthrough moment. They were interwoven with other human lineages. They exchanged genes. They shared territories. Human evolution was a braided river, not a straight canal. The human evolution mystery deepens when we realize that for tens of thousands of years, art, symbolism, and ritual were already present. Cave paintings, carved figurines, deliberate burials suggest that the modern brain was active, reflective, aware of mortality. So why no cities? Because cities are not only built with thought, they are built with ecological opportunity. Agriculture appears around 10 to 12,000 years ago when climate stabilizes after the last ice age.
Before that, the planet itself may not have permitted sustained surplus. It is not that anatomically modern humans were incapable, it is that the world was different. And so we return to the canyon of time. The missing human history is not a story of delay, it is a story of preparation. For hundreds of thousands of years, the modern brain learned landscapes, seasons, animal behavior. It refined language, it formed bonds, it endured volcanic winters and shifting glaciers. Intelligence was not dormant, it was patient. As you rest tonight, let this thought settle gently over you. We are not separated from those early humans by intellect, but by context. The same brain that once tracked herds under a cold Pleistocene sky is now tracking digital signals in distant galaxies. The difference lies in accumulated layers of stability. And yet, a question lingers at the edge of our calm reflection. If anatomically modern humans had the same cognitive potential for so long, are we certain they left no greater marks? Or have some traces simply dissolved, carried away by rising seas and eroded coastlines? We will walk closer to that shoreline soon.
Let us drift a little closer to that shoreline, the one where land meets memory and memory meets the sea. Because when we ask why anatomically modern humans did not build cities for nearly 280,000 years, we often imagine an empty continent, a silent delay, a long waiting. But what if the waiting was not emptiness at all? What if it was simply invisible to us now? During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower than today. Vast stretches of coastline that are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water were once dry plains, river valleys, fertile corridors where early humans likely gathered, hunted, and perhaps even experimented with early forms of settlement. Vince Gaffney and his colleagues, in their work on Doggerland, have shown that what is now the North Sea once held an entire lost world connecting Britain to continental Europe. Forests, marshes, and rivers existed where fishing boats now pass. If entire landscapes could disappear beneath rising seas after the Ice Age, what traces of missing human history might have vanished with them? The prehistoric time gap may not be a gap of action, but a gap of preservation. Imagine small coastal communities forming along now submerged shores, their camps gradually becoming seasonal villages. Imagine wooden structures, woven dwellings, early experiments with plant tending. Wood decays, fiber dissolves, shorelines shift. Over thousands of years, the ocean advances quietly, without drama, covering hearths, pathways, and perhaps the earliest architectural attempts. The modern brain in a Stone Age world may have been innovating in ways we can barely detect. We must remember that civilization, as we define it, is biased towards stone. Stone survives, stone temples endure. Göbekli Tepe, studied by Klaus Schmidt, astonished archaeologists precisely because it appeared far earlier than expected. Monumental stone pillars raised by hunter-gatherers before full agriculture. It was a reminder that our assumptions about the timeline of complexity can be overturned. If such a sanctuary could remain buried for millennia before being rediscovered, what else remains hidden beneath silt, beneath water, beneath layers of geological change? The human evolution mystery deepens, not because evidence is absent, but because evidence is fragile. Stanley Ambrose's discussion of climatic instability suggests that populations may have repeatedly contracted and expanded. Small groups leave small archaeological footprints. A community of a few hundred people living lightly on the land for thousands of years may leave almost nothing detectable after 100,000 years of erosion. And yet genetically, as Reich and others have shown, these populations were dynamic. They moved, interbred, adapted. They were not stagnant. The modern brain was active, creative, responsive. If you were living in such a world, would you invest in permanent stone walls if glaciers threatened to advance?
Or would you carry your knowledge within stories, within songs, within traditions passed from parent to child? The absence of cities does not equal the absence of culture. It may simply reflect a world where flexibility was more valuable than permanence. Now let the questions settle again, softly, almost like a lullaby. If you had 280,000 years before agriculture stabilized communities, what would you build? Would you focus on monumental structures or on relationships, on tracking stars for navigation, on understanding animal migrations, on refining language? Perhaps the greatest achievement of anatomically modern humans during the prehistoric time gap was not architecture, but cognition itself, the steady layering of shared knowledge, the invisible infrastructure of cooperation. Civilization may have required not just a modern brain, but a planet that allowed that brain to anchor itself in one place. Around 12,900 years ago, as suggested by research into abrupt climate shifts like the younger Dryas, dramatic environmental changes reshaped ecosystems again. Some have hypothesized catastrophic events contributing to megafaunal extinctions. Whether or not all such theories hold, what remains clear is that the late Pleistocene was a period of instability. In instability, mobility is wisdom. In mobility, permanence is postponed. So perhaps the true mystery is not why they waited, but why we expect them to have rushed. The prehistoric time gap may be teaching us humility. Our modern cities, our digital archives, our satellites feel permanent, but the Earth has repeatedly rewritten its surface. Coastlines drown, ice sheets advance, forests burn and regrow. If there were early experiments in settlement along ancient shores, the sea may indeed have swallowed every trace. And so we end this chapter not with certainty, but with a quiet possibility. Maybe anatomically modern humans did more than we currently see. Maybe some early sparks of structured life flickered briefly along vanished coasts. Maybe the ocean holds chapters of the missing human history that science has yet to recover.
Imagine standing on a vast green meadow in northern Europe, the air cool, the soil soft beneath your feet, a river winding lazily through tall grasses while herds move in the distance and small clusters of human families gather near wooden shelters. Now imagine, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the sea beginning to rise. Not in a single violent wave, not in a sudden catastrophe, but inch by inch, year by year, generation by generation. The shoreline shifts, the river mouth widens, marshland creeps inward, and one day the meadow where children once ran is beneath the tide. Along with it, paths, hearths, stories, and the fragile traces of what might have become part of our remembered history. This is not fantasy. This is Doggerland, often called Europe's lost world, a once living landscape that connected Britain to continental Europe before the North Sea existed in its present form. As we continue our journey through the prehistoric time gap and the missing human history, we arrive now at the realm of drowned worlds, of lost civilizations, not necessarily of towering stone, but of entire ecosystems and human lifeways erased beneath water. Research by Vince Gaffney, Simon Fitch, and David Smith has reconstructed this vanished terrain through seismic mapping and sediment analysis, revealing rivers, hills, and wetlands where fishing boats now cross open sea. What we call the North Sea was once a thriving plain, home to animals, forests, and likely thousands of anatomically modern humans adapting to post-glacial climates. The phrase lost civilizations often conjures images of grand temples or underwater cities carved in marble, but sometimes the greatest losses are quieter. A civilization can be a network of seasonal camps, shared knowledge of river crossings, oral maps of migration routes. In Doggerland, communities may have followed herds, fished abundant rivers, and established patterns of return year after year.
The modern brain in a Stone Age world was not idle. It was learning coastlines, reading tides, noticing subtle shifts in salinity and fish movement. As the last ice age ended and glaciers melted, global sea levels rose dramatically over thousands of years. For the people of Doggerland, climate change was not an abstract concept. It was the slow transformation of home. Imagine being born near a forest edge, only to find in adulthood that the forest is marsh, and in old age that the marsh is shallow sea. Adaptation was not optional, it was survival. This is where the idea of preservation bias becomes essential to understanding the human evolution mystery. We tend to believe that what we have found represents what existed, but archaeology favors stone, favors dryness, favors stability. Wood rots, fiber disintegrates, coastal settlements drown. Underwater cities, if built from organic materials, vanish almost entirely. The record becomes skewed toward inland caves and arid zones where preservation is kind. And so the prehistoric time gap may partly be a map distorted by water. When we speak of 63 lost civilizations or imagined 55 underwater cities, we must remember that most early human settlements were likely near coasts and rivers. These were resource-rich zones. These were logical places for repeated occupation. As seas rose, they swallowed not only land, but memory. Even now, fishermen in the North Sea occasionally dredge up bones of mammoths, stone tools, fragments of antler worked by human hands. These are whispers from beneath the waves. They remind us that the missing human history is not empty, it is submerged. The story of Doggerland is not about sudden doom, it is about gradual retreat. People moved, they adapted, they followed shifting shorelines, but each retreat erased physical traces, each migration thinned the archaeological record. The canyon of time widens here, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was carried away by water. And as you rest tonight, imagine that meadow again, but now seen through clear, cold sea. Fish drift above what was once forest floor. Light ripples across submerged hills. Somewhere beneath that surface lie the faint outlines of human presence, patient, waiting for us to understand that the earth itself is an editor of history.
Let us sink a little deeper beneath those waters now, not in fear, but in quiet curiosity. Picture the surface of the North Sea at dawn, soft gray light stretching across a horizon that reveals nothing of what lies below. Beneath that calm surface rests Doggerland, once a mosaic of wetlands, forests, and rivers where anatomically modern humans moved with purpose and awareness. This was not an empty expanse, it was a lived-in world. It was part of the great human evolution mystery, a chapter of the prehistoric time gap written in soil that no longer touches air. The concept of lost civilizations often suggests dramatic collapse, but Doggerland teaches a gentler lesson. Its disappearance was slow, almost patient. After the last ice age, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise by more than 100 meters over several millennia. For those living there, the transformation would have felt gradual but relentless. A familiar path along the riverbank would become damp, then marshy, then submerged. Hunting grounds would shrink, camps would shift inland. Each generation would move slightly higher, carrying tools, memory, and language with them. And in doing so, they left behind not monuments, but absence. This is the quiet power of preservation bias. We assume history happened where we can still see it. Yet the places most attractive to early humans were coastlines, estuaries, fertile plains. These are precisely the areas most vulnerable to rising seas. When we search for underwater cities today, scanning sonar across continental shelves, we are not chasing myths. We are acknowledging that the archaeological record is incomplete.
In Europe's Lost World, as reconstructed by Gaffney and his team, seismic data revealed entire river systems branching across what is now open water. Imagine following one of those rivers upstream 10,000 years ago, hearing birds in reeds, watching smoke rise from a distant hearth. Now imagine the same location under 30 meters of sea. The prehistoric time gap may partly be an optical illusion created by water. And yet, adaptation defines our species. Our ancestors did not simply vanish when seas rose, they learned to fish new waters. They traveled along shifting coasts, they shared knowledge about tides and currents. The modern brain in a Stone Age world was flexible. It did not cling rigidly to one landscape, it adjusted. There is something profoundly moving about that. Lost civilizations are not always tales of hubris and ruin. Sometimes they are stories of endurance without recognition. A community displaced by water may rebuild elsewhere, leaving only faint traces of where they began. If one day, thousands of years from now, much of our own coastline were submerged, what would remain? Perhaps only fragments in unexpected places, while the majority of our daily life dissolved into silt. This thought is not meant to unsettle you, it is meant to soothe the illusion that permanence defines significance. The people of Doggerland lived fully, even if their world is now underwater. Their existence matters, even if their homes are gone. The human evolution mystery expands when we realize that the missing human history may be hidden not in distant galaxies, but beneath familiar seas. When fishermen pull up antler tools or mammoth bones from the North Sea, they are lifting small pieces of a submerged archive. Each artifact whispers that our story is broader than our textbooks. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, let the image return once more. A green field slowly claimed by water, trees becoming shadows beneath the tide, human footsteps fading into sand. There is sadness in that image, yes, but also continuity. Those who left Doggerland did not disappear. They carried their modern brains, their languages, their adaptive intelligence into new territories. The sea erased their villages, but not their lineage. And perhaps that is the gentlest answer to the prehistoric time gap. Not that nothing happened, but that much happened in places the ocean now keeps secret.
So in textbooks, religion and temples come after agriculture. First we farm, then we settle. Then, with surplus grain and stable villages, we build shrines to our gods. That is the neat order of things. But on a quiet hill in southeastern Turkey, there stands a place that seems to whisper a different sequence. A sanctuary rising from the earth thousands of years before pottery, before cities, before the wheel. Göbekli Tepe, often called the oldest temple in the world. And as we continue walking through the prehistoric time gap and the missing human history, this Stone Age mystery waits for us like a chapter that appears out of order. Imagine the hill as it might have looked 12,000 years ago. The air is cool. Wild grasses ripple under a pale sky. Herds move across the horizon. There are no towns, no farms in the familiar sense. And yet, carved into the bedrock, massive T-shaped pillars rise in circular enclosures. Some weigh many tons. Their surfaces are etched with reliefs of foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, scorpions. Not crude scratches, intentional forms, stylized, deliberate, symbolic. Klaus Schmidt, who dedicated years to excavating Göbekli Tepe, described it as a Stone Age sanctuary. What astonished archaeologists was not merely its age, but its implication. These were hunter-gatherers, anatomically modern humans living before full-scale agriculture. And yet they organized labor, quarried stone, transported and erected pillars taller than a person.
They gathered, it seems, not just to survive, but to create meaning. Let the image settle softly in your mind. A ring of stone pillars beneath an open sky. No roof, no city walls surrounding it. Just earth, horizon, and carved stone. Perhaps fires flickered at night. Perhaps voices echoed between the pillars. This is not a loud revolution. It is a quiet one, because Göbekli Tepe suggests that the idea of civilization may not have begun with farming, but with gathering, with ritual, with shared imagination. The Stone Age mystery here is not that ancient people were suddenly brilliant. We already know the modern brain existed for hundreds of thousands of years. The mystery is that our narrative of progress may be too linear. We assumed that religion followed agriculture, yet Göbekli Tepe appears to precede it. Could it be that the desire to gather around sacred space helped encourage settled life, rather than the other way around? Notice how gently this question unfolds. It does not accuse. It does not overturn everything we know. It simply invites us to consider that within the prehistoric time gap, ideas may have been forming long before material conditions allowed them to crystallize into cities. The oldest temple in the world stands like a lighthouse in the fog of missing human history. It does not illuminate every page, but it tells us that the pages existed. Picture the artisans carving animals into limestone with stone tools, their hands steady, their minds envisioning creatures not merely as food, but as symbols. This requires abstraction. It requires shared stories. It requires a community willing to coordinate effort over time. None of that emerges from emptiness. It emerges from long cultural memory. And so we return to our book metaphor. If Göbekli Tepe is page 291 of a 300-page history, appearing suddenly with monumental architecture before agriculture, what were pages 1 through 290 describing? What conversations, what small gatherings, what proto-rituals slowly evolved into this sanctuary on a hill? Let yourself rest in that question. No urgency, no anxiety, just a widening sense that the human story is older, subtler, and more patient than we often imagine. Göbekli Tepe does not shout that history is wrong. It whispers that history is incomplete. And in that whisper, the prehistoric time gap feels less like silence and more like anticipation.
So let us remain on that hill a little longer. The wind moves softly across the limestone pillars. Shadows stretch slowly as the sun lowers. There is no city skyline here, no granaries, no paved roads. And yet, something profound has happened on this quiet rise in southeastern Turkey. Göbekli Tepe does not simply challenge a timeline. It challenges a feeling. The feeling that civilization arrived suddenly, like a switch flipped on. Instead, this oldest temple in the world suggests that the seeds of civilization were already alive deep within the prehistoric time gap, waiting for the right conditions to surface. Look closely in your imagination at the pillars themselves. They are not rough stones stacked in haste. They are carefully shaped into towering T-forms, some arranged in circles as if enclosing a sacred center. Carved animals move across their surfaces with intention. A fox seems to stride. A serpent curves. A vulture spreads its wings. These carvings are not mere decoration. They imply symbolic thought, shared myth, communal memory. They imply that anatomically modern humans, long before cities, were already constructing worlds of meaning.
Klaus Schmidt proposed that Göbekli Tepe may have been a gathering place for dispersed hunter-gatherer groups. Imagine that. Small communities spread across the landscape, traveling perhaps days to meet at this hill, not for trade alone, not for survival alone, but for ritual, for story, for something that binds individuals into something larger. If that is true, then perhaps agriculture did not create temples. Perhaps temples created the social cohesion that later made agriculture possible. This idea does not require dramatic revisionism, it requires gentle humility. The Stone Age mystery of Göbekli Tepe invites us to slow down and reconsider our assumptions about progress. We often imagine early humans as reactive, focused only on immediate needs. But here we see planning, coordination, and abstract vision. To quarry stone, to transport it, to erect it in circular enclosures requires cooperation across time. It requires trust. It requires belief in something that outlives a single day's hunt. As we move through the missing human history, this site becomes a lighthouse, not illuminating everything, but signaling that complex social structures existed earlier than we once thought. It reminds us that the modern brain in a Stone Age world was not waiting passively for agriculture to awaken it. It was already awake, already imagining, already weaving symbolic networks that bound communities together. And yet, Göbekli Tepe also deepens the mystery. Why was it deliberately buried? Why did later generations cover these monumental enclosures with earth, preserving them for millennia? The act of burial itself suggests intention, closure, transition. It is as if the sanctuary had fulfilled its purpose, or as if the world that required it had changed. Climate shifts near the end of the Younger Dryas period reshaped landscapes. Communities reorganized. Perhaps new forms of settlement began to anchor people more permanently. Let your mind drift back to our metaphorical book of human history. If this hilltop sanctuary represents page 291, appearing unexpectedly before the supposed beginning of civilization, then what filled pages 1 through 290? Countless small rituals, shared meals beneath open skies, stories told around firelight that gradually evolved into structured belief, knowledge passed in whispers long before it was carved in stone. The prehistoric time gap may not be empty at all. It may be dense with invisible chapters of emotional, social, and cognitive evolution. Göbekli Tepe stands as a quiet monument to that density. It tells us that even when material evidence is sparse, the human capacity for meaning-making is ancient, older than cities, older than written law. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, imagine standing once more among those pillars, the air cool, the carvings catching faint light. You are not alone. Around you are others who share language, gesture, and belief. They do not know they are building something that will puzzle distant descendants. They simply feel compelled to gather, to carve, to mark a place as sacred. And now, gently, we return to the question that lingers at the end of this chapter. If Göbekli Tepe is chapter 291 of our story, what would chapters 1 through 290 look like? Would they be quieter, smaller, scattered across landscapes now erased? Or would they reveal that the idea of civilization began not with walls and crops, but with imagination itself? In the stillness of this hill, in the whisper of wind between stone pillars, the prehistoric time gap feels less like a void and more like a vast preparation. The temple that shouldn't exist does not break the story, it expands it. And in that expansion, the mystery becomes something almost comforting, a reminder that our past is deeper than our certainty, and that the earliest pages of humanity are still waiting to be read.
So imagine this. You and your community have built something delicate but meaningful. Not necessarily towering cities, not necessarily stone monuments that pierce the sky, but systems of knowledge, gathering places, rituals, routes of migration, perhaps even the earliest fragile attempts at settlement. You know the seasons, you know the rivers, you believe you understand your world. And then, within weeks, the sky darkens, ash falls like gray snow, the sun weakens behind a veil, temperatures drop, animals vanish, plants fail, and everything you built dissolves into silence. Not through war, not through neglect, but through the indifferent force of fire and ice. As we continue exploring the prehistoric time gap and the missing human history, we arrive at a possibility that is neither dramatic fantasy nor comfortable certainty. The possibility of reset. The possibility that ancient apocalypse events, rare, devastating environmental disruptions, may have acted as erasers across chapters of our early story. Not once, perhaps more than once. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba eruption in present-day Indonesia released one of the most powerful volcanic explosions in the last 2 million years. The Toba eruption is not merely a geological footnote. According to research discussed by Stanley Ambrose, it may have triggered a volcanic winter, cooling global temperatures and dramatically reducing human populations. Imagine a world where sunlight is muted for months, perhaps years. Crops did not yet exist in structured agriculture, but wild plants were no less essential. Game animals would have struggled, food chains would have faltered. The concept, sometimes called the Toba catastrophe hypothesis, suggests that human populations may have passed through a severe bottleneck. Whether the reduction was as extreme as once proposed remains debated, but the fragility it highlights is undeniable. Even anatomically modern humans, equipped with the same cognitive capacity we possess today, would have been vulnerable to prolonged environmental shock. In such a scenario, cultural memory shrinks with population. Traditions fragment. Innovations are lost not because they were inferior, but because there are fewer people left to carry them. Let the image remain calm in your mind. No sensational firestorms, just a dimmer sky, colder winds, scarcer herds, small groups moving carefully through altered landscapes. Civilization, in its earliest forms, may not have needed total annihilation to vanish. It may have required only sustained hardship. The prehistoric time gap may include not only submerged coastlines and buried temples, but interrupted experiments in social complexity. Now, move forward in time to another moment of abrupt climate disruption. Around 12,900 years ago, at the onset of the Younger Dryas, global temperatures dropped suddenly after a period of warming. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, explored by researchers such as Firestone and colleagues, proposes that a cosmic impact or air burst may have contributed to this rapid cooling and associated megafaunal extinctions. The hypothesis remains debated, but the climatic shift itself is well documented. Within decades, ecosystems transformed. Imagine being part of a community that had begun to stabilize after millennia of glacial retreat. Rivers settled into predictable courses, resources became abundant. Then, unexpectedly, colder conditions returned. Drought in some regions, flood in others.
Large animals disappeared. This is what we might call an ancient apocalypse, not in mythic exaggeration, but in lived disruption, a reset of ecological balance. Here is where the reflection deepens. Civilization feels solid when we stand within it. Our buildings, our networks, our stored knowledge give the illusion of permanence. But the long arc of human evolution reminds us that stability is the exception, not the rule. The Toba eruption, the younger Dryas, these are reminders that the Earth itself participates in editing our story. And so, gently, without alarm, we acknowledge the fragility. The modern brain in a Stone Age world may have sparked many beginnings, but beginnings can be interrupted. The canyon of time we have been walking through may contain chapters burned by volcanic ash or frozen by sudden cold, not erased entirely, but thinned, reduced. There is something quietly stoic in this realization. Not despair, acceptance. The recognition that change is inevitable, that external events lie beyond full control. Our ancestors survived not because the world was stable, but because they adapted when it was not. The fragility of civilization does not diminish its beauty, it heightens it. As you breathe slowly tonight, imagine ash settling softly over a landscape. Then imagine the ash clearing. Small groups emerge, fires are lit again, stories are told again. The reset did not end humanity, it reshaped it. And perhaps within the prehistoric time gap, there were many such resets. Some we can detect, others lost in silence.
Let us stay with that quiet image of ash settling over the earth, not as catastrophe, but as interruption. Because when we speak of the Toba eruption or the younger Dryas impact, we are not necessarily describing the end of humanity. We are describing thinning, narrowing, a bottleneck through which only a fraction of stories pass. And in that narrowing, much can be lost. The prehistoric time gap may not be a single silence, but a series of muted echoes following environmental resets. Imagine a community that had slowly refined knowledge of seasonal patterns, of animal migrations, of edible plants, perhaps even early attempts at semi-permanent gathering sites. Now imagine that prolonged cold alters migration routes, that ash dims sunlight, that drought fractures familiar rhythms. In such conditions, survival becomes immediate again. Long-term projects are postponed, ritual centers may be abandoned, trade routes dissolve. The modern brain in a Stone Age world does not disappear, but its focus shifts inward toward endurance. Civilization in its most fragile beginnings can be paused without ever being recorded. This is the essence of fragility, not total annihilation, but interruption long enough for memory to scatter. When Stanley Ambrose discussed population bottlenecks in relation to the Toba eruption, he highlighted how reduced populations could amplify genetic drift and cultural simplification. Fewer groups mean fewer innovations maintained. Knowledge is carried in living minds, not libraries. If those minds are lost, so are the techniques, the rituals, the early experiments that might have seemed promising. Now consider the younger Dryas once more, that abrupt return to colder conditions around 12,900 years ago. Whether triggered by extraterrestrial impact or internal climatic shifts, the cooling itself is evident in ice cores and sediment layers. Ecosystems shifted rapidly. Large mammals declined or vanished in many regions. For communities on the edge of sedentism, just beginning to experiment with more stable lifeways, such disruption could feel like a reset.
not because they lacked intelligence, but because the ground beneath them changed. When we speak of ancient apocalypse, let us do so softly, not as mythic firestorms, but as the quiet force of environmental change that rearranges possibility. The fragility of civilization is not weakness, it is sensitivity to context. Our species evolved in fluctuation. Stability is rare in deep time. From a Stoic perspective, this becomes almost comforting. The Stoics taught that we control our responses, not external events. Our ancestors could not halt volcanic ash or redirect climatic cycles, but they could choose cooperation over isolation. They could choose adaptation over despair. In that sense, every environmental reset became a test of resilience rather than a final chapter. The prehistoric time gap may therefore contain not just erased attempts at complexity, but repeated rehearsals of it. Small networks form, environmental shock intervenes, networks fragment, then reform in altered landscapes, each cycle refining social cohesion, language, and shared myth. By the time agriculture finally stabilizes in multiple regions of the world, the cognitive and emotional groundwork has already been laid through countless adaptations. This is not a story of lost super civilizations wiped away in dramatic fashion. It is a story of delicate beginnings meeting unpredictable Earth. And in that meeting, we glimpse the humility of our position. Even now, our own civilization rests upon climatic stability that is not guaranteed forever. Yet here you are, listening calmly, breathing steadily. Humanity did not end with Toba. It did not vanish with the younger Dryas. It narrowed, adapted, endured. As you settle deeper into sleep, imagine a small band of survivors beneath a dim sky. They gather wood. They share food. They tell stories to children who do not yet understand how close the world came to shifting permanently. In those stories, fragments of the past are preserved, not in stone, but in memory. The reset did not erase the human spirit, it tempered it. And perhaps within the vast canyon of time, the fire and the ice were not simply destroyers, they were editors, shaping the chapters that would eventually lead to us.
How could people without telescopes describe the slow turning of the heavens across tens of thousands of years? How could voices from ancient texts speak of cycles so vast that a single human lifetime could never witness them fully? We often call such passages myth, symbolism, poetic exaggeration. But what if, at least in part, they are memory? Not precise in modern scientific language, but memory carried carefully across generations, like embers in the dark. As we move deeper into the prehistoric time gap and the missing human history, we lift our gaze from earth to sky, because sometimes the oldest archive is not stone or bone, but the stars. Imagine sitting beside a fire in a world without artificial light. The night sky stretches from horizon to horizon, impossibly clear. You grow up watching the same constellations rise in the same seasons. You notice subtle shifts. The position of sunrise on the horizon creeps slowly across decades. The stars drift almost imperceptibly over centuries. You will not live long enough to measure the full precession of the equinoxes, that 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis. But you might pass down observations to your children, they to theirs. Over generations, patterns accumulate. The precession of the equinoxes is a slow astronomical cycle discovered formally in classical antiquity, often attributed to Hipparchus. Yet certain ancient texts from various cultures speak of world ages, shifting celestial alignments, epochs defined by stars. We must be careful. This is a gray zone between science and interpretation. We are not claiming that Paleolithic astronomers calculated arc seconds. We are acknowledging that attentive observation over long time spans can generate surprisingly deep knowledge. Ancient texts are often layered documents. They contain ritual, cosmology, metaphor, but woven into them are references to long cycles, to returning ages, to skies that change over time. The term impossible knowledge is sometimes used when modern readers encounter passages that seem too precise, too expansive for the tools available at the time. Yet perhaps the word impossible reflects our assumptions more than theirs. Consider the Antikythera machine, decoded in part by researchers like Tony Freeth and colleagues. Though much later in history than the prehistoric time gap, this ancient Greek astronomical device demonstrates that complex celestial modeling existed long before modern optics. If such sophistication emerged in classical antiquity, how much earlier did sky-watching traditions begin? Sky knowledge does not require metal gears at first. It requires patience. Picture generations of observers marking solstices with stones, aligning structures to rising stars, memorizing lunar cycles. No telescope, only continuity. Oral tradition can be remarkably stable when embedded in ritual. A story about a star that once rose in the east at spring, but now rises elsewhere, might encode slow astronomical drift, not as equations, but as narrative. Here in this quiet space, we resist extremes. We do not claim lost high technology hidden in forgotten epics, nor do we dismiss ancient texts as mere fantasy. Instead, we sit in the middle ground. The human evolution mystery includes not only bones and tools, but cognition, pattern recognition, and long-term memory. The modern brain in a Stone Age world was fully capable of careful observation. When we speak of impossible knowledge in ancient texts, we are speaking of the possibility that collective memory can extend further than we expect. A culture that survives environmental resets, volcanic winters, rising seas, may cling to the sky as its most stable reference point. The Earth changes, coastlines drown, but Orion returns each winter. The Pleiades rise each year. In times of fragility, the heavens are constant enough to anchor meaning. So imagine once more that firelit circle beneath an open sky. Elders speak of a time when certain stars stood differently. Children listen. The story becomes sacred. Over centuries, metaphor wraps around observation. By the time it is written down in later ancient texts, it reads like myth, but within it may lie fragments of very old watching. And now, gently, we ask not whether they possessed forbidden secrets, but whether we underestimate the depth of human attention. If Göbekli Tepe represents stone memory, perhaps the sky represents cognitive memory. If chapter 291 is carved in limestone, what of the chapters written in constellations? Stay with that firelit circle a little longer. The night is deep now, the air cool against your skin. Above you, the sky turns with patient certainty. The constellations do not rush, they do not panic. They simply move, almost imperceptibly, across centuries. When we speak of ancient texts and the possibility of impossible knowledge, we are not searching for lost super technology hidden in myth. We are listening for continuity, for the quiet possibility that collective memory can stretch further than a single lifetime. Imagine a lineage of sky watchers, not as priests with instruments of bronze and glass, but as elders with stories. Each winter they notice where certain stars rise. Each spring they mark the sunrise against a distant hill. Each generation adjusts a tale slightly, not because they are inventing, but because they are refining. Over time, myth becomes mnemonic. Narrative becomes measurement. The precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis across roughly 26,000 years, cannot be observed in full by any one person, yet fragments of its effect can be noticed across centuries. A temple once aligned to a particular star no longer matches perfectly. A legend speaks of an age when the bull ruled the sky, or when a certain constellation marked the beginning of the year. We must tread gently here. The language of impossible knowledge often invites sensationalism. But our path tonight is slower, steadier. We are exploring the gray zone between astronomy and memory. The human evolution mystery includes not only survival through fire and ice, not only drowned worlds and buried temples, but also the steady upward gaze that accompanied every migration. When coastlines vanished and climates shifted, the sky remained the most reliable map. It changed, yes, but slowly, predictably enough to anchor ritual and calendar. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia, from Vedic traditions, from early Mediterranean cultures often encode cosmic cycles within mythic frameworks. Ages rise and fall, stars shift positions. Time is described not merely as linear, but cyclical. It would be naive to read these texts as literal astronomical manuals, but it would also be naive to assume that myth carries no observational residue. Oral tradition, when stabilized by repetition, can preserve patterns astonishingly well. Songs about star clusters that rise before planting season can last for millennia because they serve practical purpose. Think of it this way. A community that survives the Toba eruption, that adapts through the younger Dryas, that rebuilds after environmental reset, may cling to the heavens as continuity. The earth is volatile. The sky is patient. In times of fragility, people look upward for reassurance. That upward gaze becomes sacred. Over generations, sacred knowledge is guarded carefully. By the time it is written down in later ancient texts, it may appear strangely advanced, strangely comprehensive. We label it impossible knowledge because we forget how long observation can accumulate. And yet, humility again. We do not claim certainty. We are not saying that prehistoric astronomers calculated precession with mathematical precision, or that forgotten civilizations mastered physics beyond their era. We are acknowledging possibility within limits. That careful observation, repeated across centuries, can generate deep understanding even without modern instruments. That collective memory, anchored in ritual, can preserve fragments of very long cycles. Picture a child sitting beside an elder beneath a sky ablaze with stars. The elder points to a constellation and speaks of how it once rose at a different season. The child does not fully grasp the timescale, but the story embeds itself. The story is retold. Minor adjustments occur. Eventually, written scribes preserve a version. Thousands of years later, we read it and wonder how such knowledge was possible. This is not a tale of conspiracy. It is a tale of patience. The prehistoric gap may contain not only material experiments lost to sea and ash, but intellectual traditions too subtle to fossilize. We search for stone pillars and sunken landscapes because they are tangible, but cognition leaves lighter traces. A carved animal at Göbekli Tepe may hint at symbolic thought. A myth about shifting heavens may hint at astronomical memory. Both are fragments of a larger tapestry. Now return to our metaphorical book of 300 pages. Göbekli Tepe might be page 291 carved in limestone. Doggerland might be a chapter dissolved in water. The Toba eruption might have singed several pages with ash. And the sky? The sky might be the margin notes written in starlight along every missing page. As you drift closer to sleep,
Imagine lying on your back on ancient grass, long before cities, long before telescopes. The Milky Way spills overhead like a river of light. You do not know the term precession of the equinoxes. You do not know orbital mechanics, but you know that the stars move with intention and pattern. You watch, you remember, you tell a story. And perhaps that is the gentlest answer to the mystery of impossible knowledge in ancient texts. Not that our ancestors possessed forbidden secrets, but that they possessed time. Time to watch, time to repeat, time to carry memory forward even when landscapes burned, froze, or drowned. In the stillness of the night, the human story feels less like a gap and more like a slow accumulation. Fire reshaped it, ice narrowed it, oceans swallowed parts of it. But above it all, the sky kept turning. And somewhere between myth and measurement, between ritual and astronomy, fragments of the earliest chapters may still shimmer quietly, waiting for us to read them not with urgency, but with wonder.
There may have been a moment in our deep past when the entire human species was reduced to only a few thousand individuals, fewer than the number of people in a small stadium today. Fewer voices, fewer stories, fewer hands to carry memory forward. And yet, they did not surrender. As we move gently through the prehistoric time gap and the missing human history, we now arrive at one of the most humbling ideas in human evolution, the population bottleneck. A narrowing so severe that our lineage almost flickered out like a flame in the wind. The term population bottleneck refers to a dramatic reduction in the size of a species, leaving only a small genetic pool to continue. Stanley Ambrose, writing in 1998, explored the possibility that events such as the Toba eruption may have contributed to such a bottleneck in prehistoric population. While the scale remains debated, genetic evidence suggests that modern humans share a striking degree of similarity, hinting that our ancestors passed through a narrow corridor of survival. Imagine a wide river forced through a thin canyon. Everything upstream converges into a single, fragile flow. Picture small bands of anatomically modern humans scattered across harsh landscapes. Food is uncertain, climate unstable. Perhaps volcanic winters dim the sun. Perhaps drought stretches across once fertile regions. In such times, human survival is no longer abstract. It is immediate. It is breath to breath. Fire must be kept alive. Children must be protected. Knowledge must be remembered even when there is no parchment, no monument, no stone pillar. Genetic studies, including work by David Reich and colleagues, reveal how intertwined our ancestry is. We carry traces of archaic hominins, such as Neanderthals and Denisovans. These interactions remind us that our survival was not solitary, it was braided. When populations shrink, interbreeding and cooperation become pathways of continuity. The human evolution mystery here is not about grand architecture or lost civilizations. It is about persistence, about enduring when numbers fall dangerously low. Let this image settle softly. A cold night, a handful of people gathered around a fire. Beyond the circle of light, vast darkness. Perhaps somewhere else, another small group mirrors them. They do not know they are a bottleneck. They do not know that thousands of generations later, their descendants will number in billions. They only know that tomorrow requires strength.
The prehistoric population during such bottlenecks may have been so small that entire branches of culture vanished without trace. Songs forgotten, techniques abandoned, rituals interrupted. Within the prehistoric time gap, there may have been chapters written in fragile ink, erased not by oceans or ash alone, but by the simple arithmetic of too few survivors. This is not melodrama, it is mathematics. When a culture shrinks to a handful, diversity narrows, memory thins. And yet, within that thinning, something remarkable occurred. The flame did not go out. Human survival persisted. The modern brain in the Stone Age world continued to adapt, to strategize, to cooperate. Stoic philosophy, though articulated much later in written form, echoes something ancient in this resilience, the acceptance of hardship without surrender. Our ancestors could not control volcanic eruptions or abrupt climate shifts, but they could control their response. They could endure. There is quiet power in imagining that we descend from those who survived the narrowest margins. Every one of us carries genetic memory of bottleneck and recovery, of contraction and expansion. The canyon of time does not only contain lost temples and drowned worlds, it contains nights of doubt, hunger, and determination that left no fossil. As you breathe slowly tonight, let yourself feel the smallness and the strength of that ancient circle of firelight. A few thousand humans, perhaps fewer, scattered across continents, holding on. Within their fragile existence may have existed entire worlds of meaning, entire experiments in social structure, entire chapters of missing human history that no longer echo. And yet, from that edge, they stepped forward. The bottleneck did not define the end. It defined the beginning of everything that followed.
Stay with that fragile circle of firelight just a little longer. The wind moves softly beyond it, and in that darkness lies the true scale of the population bottleneck. When geneticists speak of prehistoric population shrinking, they do not mean a quiet demographic fluctuation. They mean a narrowing so extreme that entire genetic branches disappear forever. Whole variations of humanity fade without leaving descendants. And yet, from that razor-thin thread, human survival continued. Stanley Ambrose's work on late Pleistocene bottlenecks suggests that environmental catastrophes, including the Toba eruption, may have dramatically reduced human numbers. Whether the reduction was as severe as once hypothesized or more gradual, the genetic signal remains compelling. Modern humans are surprisingly alike at the DNA level. Compared to many other species, our genetic diversity is relatively low. This suggests that at some point in the prehistoric time gap, our ancestors passed through a constriction so tight that only a small number carried forward the blueprint of humanity. Now imagine the psychological dimension of that survival. When a population shrinks to only a few thousand, perhaps scattered in isolated bands, knowledge becomes fragile. If one elder dies without passing on a skill, that skill may vanish. If one group fails to adapt to shifting climate, that branch ends. In this way, the missing human history may not only be the result of oceans swallowing coastlines or ash burying settlements, but of silence, of traditions that had no one left to remember them. Yet survival is not passive, it is active, adaptive, resilient. The same modern brain that contemplates stars and carves symbols into stone was also capable of endurance. Cooperation intensifies when numbers shrink. Social bonds strengthen. Shared responsibility becomes vital.
The prehistoric population that survived did so not through dominance alone, but through flexibility. They moved when landscapes changed. They experimented with tools. They integrated with neighboring groups, as genetic evidence from Reich and others shows through traces of Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry within us today. Survival was braided, not isolated. There is something profoundly grounding about this. We often measure civilization by monuments, by writing, by cities, but the most important chapter of our story may have been written in restraint, in not giving up, in continuing to gather food, to teach children, to protect the vulnerable even when the future felt uncertain. The Stoic insight, articulated thousands of years later, that we cannot control external events but can control our response, feels almost prehistoric in origin. Our ancestors could not command volcanoes or glaciers. They could only respond, and they did so with enough steadiness to keep the species alive. Picture a generation born during that bottleneck. They would not know that they stood on the edge of extinction. They would not have statistics. They would only sense scarcity. Fewer distant tribes, fewer unfamiliar voices encountered along migration routes, perhaps wider empty landscapes where others once lived. In that quiet thinning of humanity, every child carried disproportionate weight. Every success mattered. Within that narrowing may have existed entire cultural worlds now lost. Stories, artistic expressions, belief systems that vanished simply because too few survived to continue them. The prehistoric time gap may contain not one lost civilization, but thousands of microcultures extinguished without trace. And yet, what remained was enough. Enough memory, enough cooperation, enough innovation. As numbers slowly recovered and expanded, new diversity emerged from that constrained genetic pool. The bottleneck did not freeze humanity into weakness, it refined it through pressure. Not in a triumphant, dramatic sense, but in a quiet, evolutionary one. Those who endured passed on not only genes, but strategies, adaptability, curiosity, resilience. So tonight, as you breathe slowly and allow your mind to soften, consider this. You are a descendant of survivors from a species that once hovered at the edge. Within your cells lies the echo of a time when humanity was rare and fragile. The prehistoric population could have vanished into fossil footnotes. Instead, they persisted. And perhaps in that long, dark stretch when human numbers were few, entire chapters of history unfolded that we will never read. Experiments in cooperation, innovations in tool-making, stories told under starlight that ended when the last voice faded. The canyon of time holds those silences gently. But the flame did not die. It narrowed, trembled, nearly went out, and then widened again. From that bottleneck emerged migrations, monuments, agriculture, cities, and eventually the quiet moment in which you now listen. The population bottleneck was not merely a crisis, it was proof that even at the edge, human survival finds a way forward. And in that steady persistence, the missing pages of our story feel less tragic and more like hidden roots, deep, unseen, yet essential to everything that stands above them today.
So, if a finely crafted mechanical computer could rust quietly beneath the sea for 2,000 years before we rediscovered it, how many older machines have dissolved into dust long before we even learned to ask the question? Imagine divers descending through cold Mediterranean water, beams of light cutting through suspended particles, illuminating the broken ribs of an ancient shipwreck. Among amphorae and statues lies something stranger, a corroded cluster of bronze gears. At first glance, it looks like debris, but slowly, patiently, scholars begin to understand that this object, what we now call the Antikythera mechanism, is not simple ornamentation. It is calculation. It is astronomy translated into metal. It is ancient technology so refined that it feels almost misplaced in time. In 2006, detailed imaging and analysis by researchers including Tony Freeth and colleagues revealed the astonishing complexity of this device. Interlocking gears modeled lunar cycles, eclipse predictions, even subtle astronomical variations. The mechanism embodied knowledge of celestial patterns encoded mechanically, not as poetry, not as myth, but as a machine. When we hear about technologies that shouldn't exist, it is tempting to leap toward fantasy. But here is something real, tangible, preserved by accident in the silent embrace of the sea. Let the image soften. The machine was not glowing. It was not futuristic. It was bronze and fragile, exposed to saltwater corrosion for centuries. It survived by chance. Had currents shifted differently, had the wreck broken apart more completely, we might never have known it existed. That thought alone invites humility. If one example of advanced ancient technology can disappear so thoroughly that it takes 2 millennia to rediscover, what of other artifacts that did not enjoy such improbable preservation? The prehistoric time gap stretches far beyond 2,000 years. It stretches back hundreds of thousands. During that immense span, organic materials decay. Wood rots, fibers disintegrate, even metal corrodes. The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a fragmentary echo shaped by preservation bias. We find what stone and accident allow us to find. The Antikythera mechanism survived because it sank in a particular way under particular conditions. It is not proof of lost supercivilizations. It is proof that complexity can be hidden for astonishing lengths of time. Now imagine the machines in the mist, not as science fiction contraptions humming in forgotten temples, but subtle, ingenious devices built from materials that do not endure. Water clocks, wooden astronomical models, mechanical tools passed down for generations before succumbing to decay. During the missing human history of the prehistoric population, how many experiments in tool-making and measurement rose briefly, served their purpose, and vanished? The canyon of time is thick with fog. Within that fog, entire chapters may have flickered and faded. The Antikythera mechanism reminds us that ancient minds were capable of extraordinary synthesis. It connects back to our earlier reflection on maps of the sky. Observational knowledge accumulated across generations can eventually crystallize into mechanism. The leap from watching stars to modeling their cycles and gears is not supernatural, it is cumulative. It requires patience, collaboration, and stable conditions. When those conditions are disrupted by invasion, by disaster, by decline, knowledge can scatter. Let your breathing slow as you imagine a craftsman in a dim workshop 2,000 years ago, carefully cutting gear teeth by hand. He does not believe he is building something out of time. He is simply solving a problem: how to track celestial motion reliably. His creation is practical, perhaps even routine within his context. Yet centuries later, it appears miraculous because the chain of transmission broke. We encounter it isolated, stripped of its cultural ecosystem, and it feels anomalous. And so the question gently widens. If such an object can disappear within recorded history, what of technologies that emerged during the vast prehistoric time gap? Not advanced in a modern sense, but refined,
elegant, suited to their environment. Wooden mechanisms aligned with solstices, complex counting systems etched into perishable surfaces, technologies that shouldn't exist only because our surviving record is incomplete. The mist of the past is not sinister, it is simply deep. Within it, machines once moved, gears once turned, hands once measured the sky. And whether preserved in bronze beneath the sea or dissolved entirely, those acts of ingenuity are part of the same long human arc that carried us from fragile bottleneck to modern complexity. The Antikythera mechanism is a whisper from that arc, reminding us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, only a quiet invitation to wonder.
Let us drift a little deeper into that mist. The sea has returned to silence above the Antikythera mechanism. The bronze gears no longer turn, yet in our imagination they begin to move again, slowly, deliberately, tracing eclipses and lunar cycles. When we hold such an object in mind, it changes the texture of the prehistoric time gap. The gap no longer feels empty, it feels incomplete. Ancient technology does not need to rival modern machines to be profound. It only needs to be unexpected within its context. The Antikythera mechanism is unsettling not because it defies physics, but because it reveals how fragile continuity can be. The knowledge required to construct it did not vanish because it was false. It vanished because civilizations fracture, workshops close, teachers die without apprentices, political upheaval interrupts transmission. Over time, what was once routine becomes anomaly. Now widen the lens beyond 2,000 years. The missing human history stretches back not centuries, but hundreds of millennia. During that vast duration, anatomically modern humans experimented with materials and ideas in ways we can barely reconstruct. We find stone tools because stone survives. We find monumental pillars like those at Göbekli Tepe because limestone endures. But what of wood? What of fiber? What of delicate mechanisms carved from organic matter? They dissolve into soil and silence. Imagine a prehistoric community developing a sophisticated calendrical device made from carved wood and bone, calibrated carefully to the solstice sunrise over a distant ridge. It serves its purpose for generations. It guides planting, ritual, migration. Then climate shifts. The ridge is abandoned. The device decays. No trace remains. Without preservation, complexity becomes invisible. The archaeological record whispers, but it does not shout. Technologies that shouldn't exist often reflect our surprise more than historical impossibility. When we say something feels out of time, we reveal our expectation that knowledge progresses in a straight, uninterrupted line. But history is rarely linear. It pulses, it advances, retreats, fragments, reforms. The Toba eruption, climatic fluctuations like the younger Dryas, regional collapses, each could interrupt chains of innovation. Within a population bottleneck, knowledge can narrow as sharply as genes. And yet, the human mind persists. The same cognitive capacity that once observed the precession of the Equinoxes, that carved animals into stone pillars, that endured survival on the edge, also tinkered with mechanism. Innovation does not appear suddenly from nothing. It accumulates quietly in workshops, around hearths, in experimental gestures repeated until they become tradition. Picture a dim coastal workshop in the Hellenistic world. Bronze filings scatter across a wooden table.
Outside, ships move between ports carrying ideas as well as goods. A craftsman refines gear ratios to match celestial cycles. He is not inventing magic, he is refining memory into metal. When that ship later sinks and the workshop disappears, the line of transmission may fracture. Centuries pass, the world changes. When modern divers rediscover the mechanism, it appears as if a ghost from the future has emerged from the past. Now imagine multiplying that fragility across the entire prehistoric time gap. Not advanced industrial machines, but modest, brilliant devices. Measuring rods, counting boards, star trackers, water clocks, crafted from materials that rarely fossilize. How many cycles of invention and loss occurred within 280,000 years? How many technologies rose to meet immediate needs, flourished briefly, and then dissolved? The mist metaphor feels appropriate because fog does not erase what lies within it, it merely obscures. The canyon of time still holds its layers. Beneath sediment and sea, beneath ash and soil, fragments remain. But many more fragments have already returned to elements. In that sense, ancient technology is less about mystery and more about humility. We see only what survives. As you ease toward rest, let the image soften once more. The sea is calm, the shipwreck sleeps. Bronze gears lie silent in darkness. Yet somewhere in the long arc of human existence, hands once shaped them with patience and care. Somewhere earlier still, other hands shaped tools whose traces we will never uncover. The prehistoric time gap may never be fully explained, not because it hides impossible secrets, but because time is selective in what it preserves. Machines in the mist are reminders that innovation is older than our surviving record, that intelligence did not wait politely for writing to begin, that creativity flickered long before it fossilized. And perhaps that is the gentlest conclusion. We do not stand at the peak of a perfectly documented ladder. We stand at the visible edge of a much deeper foundation. Beneath us lie lost gears, vanished workshops, dissolved mechanisms, and unrecorded ingenuity. They are not gone in spirit. They live quietly in the continuity of human curiosity. The same curiosity that led divers to lift bronze from the sea now leads us to ask what else the mist still holds.
When a scientist says, "We don't know," it is not an admission of defeat. It is an invitation, a quiet doorway opening into the dim corridor of unanswered questions. In a world that often demands certainty, those 4 words carry unusual courage. And as we approach the edge of the prehistoric time gap, the missing human history and the mysteries of human evolution, we find that some of the most important chapters end not with conclusions, but with humility. Science has illuminated vast stretches of our past. We know that anatomically modern humans emerged roughly 300,000 years ago. We know that agriculture began around 10 to 12,000 years ago. We know that monumental structures like Göbekli Tepe challenge earlier assumptions about the order of social development. Yet between these points lies a deep expanse where clarity fades. What science can't explain is not a catalog of failures, but a map marked with blank spaces. One such space concerns the timing of what we often call the civilizational explosion. Why did large-scale urban life, writing systems, and complex states appear relatively late compared to the long existence of modern cognition? The modern brain in a Stone Age world was already capable of abstraction, symbolism, and planning.
For hundreds of thousands of years, humans painted caves, crafted tools, buried their dead with intention. Yet city grids, irrigation networks, and bureaucratic scripts emerge much later. The question is not whether prehistoric people were intelligent. The question is why certain thresholds of social complexity were crossed when they were. Another acknowledged uncertainty involves the scale and distribution of lost landscapes. Doggerland, once connecting Britain to mainland Europe, lay exposed during lower sea levels and then vanished beneath rising waters. Vince Gaffney and colleagues have mapped parts of this drowned world, revealing river systems and potential habitation zones. But how many similar coastal plains around the globe now rest beneath the sea? Coastal zones are ideal for early settlement. If large portions of early human communities occupied shorelines later submerged, then the archaeological record is inherently incomplete. The mysteries of human history include not only what was built, but where it now lies hidden. Science continues to refine its understanding of prehistoric population size and movement. Genetic studies, such as those by David Reich and others, reveal intricate patterns of interbreeding, migration, and adaptation. Yet genetic signals can only tell us so much about culture, belief, and social organization. A population bottleneck may be visible in DNA, but the emotional world of those survivors remains inaccessible. We can estimate numbers. We cannot fully reconstruct their inner narratives. Then there are broader climatic and environmental puzzles. The younger Dryas cooling event, potentially influenced by complex interactions including extraterrestrial impacts, as explored by Firestone and colleagues, remains a subject of debate. Climate shifts reshaped habitats and forced adaptation. But how directly did such events shape the trajectory toward agriculture and settlement? Did catastrophe accelerate innovation, or did stability nurture it? These are ongoing discussions, not settled verdicts. In each of these areas, science maintains discipline. Hypotheses are tested, evidence is weighed, alternative explanations are considered. There is no grand conspiracy of ignorance. There is instead an honest boundary where data thins. And within that boundary lies the fertile space of inquiry. As you listen, perhaps already drifting toward sleep, notice how the phrase, "we don't know," feels different from silence. It carries direction. It says, there is more to learn. The prehistoric time gap is not an abyss swallowing meaning. It is a frontier. The canyon of time does not mock us. It invites patience. So when researchers admit uncertainty about the true scale of lost civilizations or the precise pathways from foraging to farming, they are not retreating. They are leaving the door open. The unknown remains vast, but it is not chaotic. It is structured by evidence, bounded by method, and animated by curiosity. And in that quiet, disciplined humility, science reveals something profoundly human: the willingness to stand at the edge of darkness and continue asking gentle, persistent questions. Stay with that doorway for a moment longer, the one that opens not into answers, but into possibility. When science admits uncertainty, it does not dissolve into chaos. It becomes more precise about its limits. And those limits are where the prehistoric time gap feels most alive. Because what science can't explain is not a void filled with fantasy, but a structured silence filled with careful questions. Consider the scale of prehistoric population across continents. We can model numbers through genetic diversity and archaeological density, yet estimates vary widely. Were there moments when entire regions thrived with complex social networks that left only faint traces? Or were human groups perpetually small, mobile, and dispersed until agriculture anchored them? The data points exist, but the full picture remains blurred. The mysteries of human history here are not dramatic secrets, they are gradients of probability. There is also the question of cognitive and cultural thresholds. We know the modern brain has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, but the great leap forward in symbolic expression, advanced art, ornamentation, ritual complexity, appears unevenly across geography and time. Did innovation bloom independently in multiple regions? Did environmental pressures accelerate symbolic thinking? Or have we simply failed to uncover earlier evidence now lost beneath sediment and sea? The archaeological record cannot speak for what is completely decayed. Science also continues to refine the timeline of migrations. Genetic evidence reveals branching paths out of Africa, interwoven with archaic hominins. Yet the precise routes, the rhythms of movement, the motivations behind each journey remain partially inferred. We see footprints in metaphorical sand, but not the faces of those who made them. We know that human survival required adaptability. We do not know the full emotional and social landscapes that shaped each decision to move or stay. And then there is the profound question of scale. How advanced were certain prehistoric communities in ways we do not recognize because their achievements did not fossilize into stone? Göbekli Tepe once forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about the relationship between religion and agriculture. Doggerland forced reconsideration of how much land, and perhaps how much human activity, now lies beneath the ocean. The Antikythera mechanism forced a re-evaluation of ancient technology. Each discovery does not overthrow science, it refines it. It demonstrates that our current model is provisional. That provisional nature is strength, not weakness. Science thrives not on rigid certainty, but on revision. When new evidence emerges, interpretations shift. What science can't explain today may become tomorrow's clarified chapter. But some aspects of the prehistoric time gap may remain permanently opaque. Entire cultures may have left no surviving material trace. Entire experiments in social organization may have flourished briefly and vanished within a population bottleneck. As you listen, allow yourself to feel the calm within that uncertainty. The unknown does not threaten the story, it deepens it. The canyon of time is not a broken bridge, it is a landscape still under exploration. When researchers publish phrases like insufficient data or uncertain chronology, they are not closing doors, they are leaving margins for future insight. Imagine future archaeologists uncovering something that reshapes our current understanding. Perhaps a submerged settlement preserved by rare conditions. Perhaps genetic evidence revealing unexpected complexity in prehistoric population structures. Each such discovery will not eliminate mystery, it will move the boundaries slightly forward. And perhaps that is the most human aspect of all. We stand within a continuum of inquiry. Our ancestors watched the sky without knowing orbital mechanics. We analyze DNA without fully reconstructing lived experience. They left us fragments. We leave future generations questions. So as this chapter settles gently towards silence, remember that we don't know is not the end of the conversation. It is the continuation of it. The prehistoric time gap remains one of the great mysteries of human history, not because it defies reason, but because time is vast and preservation is selective. In the quiet of the night, that humility feels soothing. We do not need every page of the 300-page book to appreciate the story. Some chapters are ash, some are drowned, some are written in stars, and some remain unwritten, waiting for careful minds to approach them not with urgency, but with patience. Science stands at the edge of that unwritten space, lantern in hand, acknowledging both the light it casts and the darkness that still surrounds it.
Tonight, you are lying here listening to the lost pages of history being gently turned in the dark. But tomorrow morning, when you wake, you will write another line into that same human story. The canyon of time, the prehistoric time gap, the mysteries of human history we have wandered through together are not sealed vaults behind us. They are foundations beneath us. And in this quiet final chapter, the question shifts from what science can't explain to what you will choose to live. We began with missing pages, with the image of 290 pages torn from a 300-page book. We stood before drowned worlds like Doggerland, imagined ancient technology rusting beneath the sea, felt the tremor of a population bottleneck where human survival balanced on a narrow thread. We walked through Göbekli Tepe, touched the bronze gears of the Antikythera mechanism, listened to what science admits it still doesn't know. Each mystery of human history widened the horizon, yet now the horizon narrows gently, not toward emptiness, but toward breath. The meaning of history is not only in grand monuments or vanished civilizations, it is also in continuity. You are the quiet continuation of every ancestor who survived volcanic winters, shifting climates, rising seas. You are the living echo of prehistoric population that endured when numbers were small and hope uncertain. The human story is not finished. It is unfolding in your decisions, your patience, your resilience. There is something profoundly stoic in this perspective. The Stoic perspective does not demand that we solve every mystery before we act. It reminds us that some things lie beyond control. The vastness of time, the selective preservation of evidence, the uncertainty of lost civilizations. But what remains within control is the present choice: how to respond, how to carry forward the flame handed down through bottlenecks and resets. Think of the scientists whose work we gently referenced: Ambrose exploring population bottlenecks, Reich tracing genetic threads across continents, Freeth decoding ancient technology. None of them claimed finality. Each worked within limits, illuminating small regions of darkness. That is the rhythm of inquiry, and that same rhythm exists in ordinary life. You may not map prehistoric migration routes or decode bronze gears, but you participate in continuity each time you choose patience over panic, curiosity over cynicism. The prehistoric time gap may always remain mystery. Some unwritten pages will remain ash. Some will remain submerged. Some may surface slowly in future excavations. But the deeper truth is that history is not merely something behind you, it flows through you. Every breath tonight is linked to a chain of survival stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Every heartbeat is evidence that the bottleneck did not close entirely. As you lie here, allow the scale of that continuity to soften rather than overwhelm. You are not required to solve the unknown. You are only invited to live within it wisely. The meaning of history is not certainty. It is participation. It is the understanding that the story still being told
includes your quiet choices tomorrow morning. Perhaps when you wake, you will step into your day without thinking of Göbekli Tepe or ancient texts or technologies that shouldn't exist, and that is perfectly human. Yet somewhere in the background, there may linger a gentler awareness that your life is part of a long arc, that resilience is not new, that curiosity is ancient, that uncertainty has always accompanied progress. The unwritten pages are not empty, they are waiting. Not for grand empires or monumental architecture, but for steady, thoughtful living. The Stoic perspective invites acceptance of what remains unknown, paired with deliberate action in what is known. You cannot rewrite the missing 290 pages, but you can choose how the next sentence unfolds. So, as the night deepens and your thoughts begin to drift, imagine the book of humanity resting open. Some pages are charred, some are water-stained, some are brilliantly illuminated, and at the very edge, a blank page glows faintly in the candlelight. You do not need to rush to fill it. It will be written in small acts: kindness, endurance, learning, reflection. The human story continues not through certainty, but through continuity, through breath, through patience, through the quiet courage of existing within mystery. And as sleep gently approaches, let that thought cradle you. The past is vast, the unknown is honest, and tomorrow, softly and steadily, you will add another line to the story still being told.